On 6 November 1991, Mrs. Parimala with her family took a night trip vacation. The family consists of Mrs. Parimala, her husband Mr. Selapan, 3 children and her mother. Once they had finished packing everything that they needed, her husband Mr. Selapan assisted her in loading everything into the car with license plate number BCC 2412. Mrs. Parimala called her children to get into the car. Mr. Selapan began driving the car out of their home and towards the intended location. Taking the highway, the car entered the Pagoh toll gate and was travelling through the northbound line towards Air Keroh at around 8 p.m. Everyone in the car seemed happy and very excited about their trip and was having utmost fun without them knowing what would happen to them that night. Due to the long journey ahead of them, Mrs. Parimala with her children and her mother had fallen asleep while her husband continued to drive the car. After several minutes, Mrs. Parimala woke up and accompanied Mr. Selapan to drive. During the journey, the ride was quite peaceful considering that there were few to no cars on the road. However, around kilometer 138.5, a cow unexpectedly wandered onto the road, startling Mr. Selapan, which resulted in a collision and sending the cow tumbling on the highway. One of the PLUS workers who was on duty that night noticed Mrs. Parimala's car, rushed to see what happened and checked the conditions at that time. The person in charge made the decision to report the incident to the police. Several moments later, the police arrived at the scene and the journalists after that to take the pictures of the incident. Subsequently, the police declared that Mr. Selapan had died on scene. A few days later, Mrs. Parimala went to the PLUS authorities to express her dissatisfaction about PLUS duty-related neglect in ensuring the safety of the highway. She also demanded compensation from the PLUS and held them accountable for the tragedy that affected her and her family. However, PLUS authorities had denied Mrs. Parimala's request, claiming that they were not responsible for the incident. Mrs. Parimala was devastated by this and intended to sue the PLUS authorities. On the same day, Mrs. Parimala met Ethicon Ramasamy from E. Ramasamy & Co. for this suitcase and explained what happened during the incident. After telling the full story of the incident, Ethicon Ramasamy has agreed to be a lawyer on behalf of Parimala as he believes Mrs. Parimala has solid evidence and can win this case in the court. A few days later, the PLUS authority received a letter of summons from E. Ramasamy & Co. on behalf of Mrs. Parimala and felt frustrated. To defend themselves from the lawsuit, PLUS went to Abu Talib Shahrum and Zahari.co and met a lawyer named Ashok K. Raman. They began with explaining what had happened during the incident. After some discussions, Ashok K. Raman and the PLUS authority agreed to cooperate together to make sure they can win this case.
Fight!
See you in court! On the day of trial,